Welcome to Class Act Coaching, a podcast for teachers and instructional coaches. This show is brought to you by the Southern Regional Education Board. At SREB, we believe every one of you deserves a coach. Whether you're inspiring students or guiding teachers, let our school improvement team be your coach this week. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Ashley Shaw. As usual, I'll be the host of this episode, and with me is my co-host, Dan Rock. Welcome, Dan.
Hey, how are you doing, Ashley?
I am doing great. I am really looking forward to our topic today because it's something that I know I struggle with a lot in my classes. So I'm hoping that we're going to have a really great lesson today.
Oh, I think you're going to really like it because I've got some good people lined up for you in the next few episodes. What is something that you're concerned about?
Okay. So this is something that actually I could improve on, not just my students, so I can't really judge them for this. But one thing that they're not great at, that I'm also not great at, is taking notes. I want them to actually, when we are talking about things in class, take notes on it and take notes that are actually going to help them. And I want to learn how to take notes that'll actually help me. So going to help everybody today. Do you have anybody that can help with that?
Yes, that's a great thing to think about as a teacher because we assume that we all agree what taking notes means and what effective ways there are. And the question is there certain strategies that have been proven to help kids retain information? The best person, I think, to help you with that is Donn Kirkwood. Donn Kirkwood is a senior leadership coach. He works all over the country with teachers and leaders and helps them use really some of the best evidence-based practices. He really has a deep understanding of what the science of learning is. And I think that is the kind of help that's going to really appeal to what you're trying to do. So let's get Donn in here.
All right. I'm looking forward to talking to him, and I'll talk to you after the episode.
Excellent.
Hi, Donn.
Hi, Ashley. Thank you for this amazing opportunity to sit down and talk about note-taking today.
I am looking forward to it because if you can help me get my students to be better note takers, then I am going to love this episode. But before we get into that, can you please tell me a little bit about who you are?
I am Donn Kirkwood, a senior leadership coach at the Southern Regional Education Board, where I focus on improving literacy skills across the nation, especially in the South. My work involves collaborating with educational leaders to develop instructional frameworks with professional support, and then working with teachers to implement strategies that enhance literacy outcomes for students at every stage of learning. I am passionate about the role literacy plays in shaping personal and academic success. I am committed to helping schools and communities create environments where all learners could thrive and reach their full potential.
Well, that sounds great. As an ELA instructor, anybody that focuses on literacy is a great person. But also, it's a really helpful thing because today I would like to talk to you about some tips on getting my students to be better note takers. And hey, I need to take notes sometimes too. Maybe you'll give me some tips on how to be a better note taker that I can use along with my students. So I think somebody focused on literacy should be pretty good at that. What do you have for us about note taking?
Well, let me just ask a simple question. How are you taking notes right now?
So you mean my students or me?
Like right now, you said you're taking notes. I see the pen in your
Yes.
literally
me.
You have a strategy that you feel that works.
I have a piece of blank paper that says Donn's episode note taking. That's what it says at the top. And I literally just write down ideas that you give me. As you go, I'll just write down things that you say to me that I think will help me in my class. And at the end of this episode, I might do a little wrap up. But there is no strategy involved. It is literally a blank piece of paper.
What is the strategy you use with your students within your classroom?
I have slides sometimes. I try not to rely too much on slides, but I do have slides and I tell them, okay, every research out there says you'll do better if you write down the notes in your own words. So I will not share my slides afterwards, except for in special circumstances. You have to take notes while I'm talking through these. And then they get out their phone and take a picture of each slide. So And then I just let them and I don't enforce anything. So it doesn't do any good because they're still not writing it down in their own words. And that's my note taking in class strategy.
Interesting. Let me ask you another question. Why are you having to take notes?
So, because like I tell them, the research that I have seen suggests that, if I'm up there, again, I try not to rely on strictly lectures. We do activities, we do things, we do discussions. But at certain points, I do need to do a little bit of lecturing. And when I'm doing that, I'm saying it in my words. And all the research says that you're going to get it better if you put it in your words. So I try to get them to take notes. It's not something that I check, I don't have to turn it in. But because I think if they're writing it down, what I'm saying, but they're putting it in their words instead of mine, that they're going to process it better and they're going to remember it better. But getting them to actually take the time to do that is an uphill battle.
Oh, most definitely. I think where we really need to start is coming up with a clear step strategy. A strategy that students could use with confidence in any situation, walking into a college class, into an English class, into a CTE class.
Right.
So if they take a picture, then it just becomes a document on their phone that they could reference. There's no guarantee that they actually are comprehending what's in that picture. But at the same time, we have to be very careful that our students don't just replicate what we give to our students. Because when students copy, they're actually using a different part of the brain. I usually tell teachers that you could have a student that just came here, brand new from another country, that has no English skills, and they could copy your slide perfectly, but it doesn't mean they comprehend it.
Right. That makes sense.
But it just starts there. It's like we want the students to really comprehend the information. Now, I would always try to push students or teachers more towards having students take a document and find their own key details. And sometimes pretty much doing what you did to put all that information into that PowerPoint. Because when we look at the ACT, 51% of the questions is about students identifying key information. So how do we give them those opportunities, those experiences in the classroom? Now we have so much content we have to teach. We often try to just summarize it all for them and put it into a presentation. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves lecturing, and sometimes we find ourselves bored out of our mind because we're waiting for the last student to get everything off that slide, and they're always raising their hand. Oh, give me another minute. Well,
Yes.
we have some students that have finished it up rather quickly, and they're sitting there like, what can I do while I wait for that one student to finish up that slide? So
That means talk to the person beside them that's also already taken a picture of it and not written anything down. That's what that means.
exactly. We want to take note taking and turn it into a learning experience for students. Like, not only are they comprehending the information, but they're processing the information. Have you ever heard about chunk the information?
Can you tell us what it is?
Well, when we look at the attention span of these students, well, we're probably looking at maybe 9 to 12 minutes. But if we're able to chunk the information, that moves from, and how I would chunk it is to move back and forth from comprehending, taking the information from you, to processing, making connections, that real life situations. Sometimes we do it as teachers. We try to narrate it and bring the information to life, but at the same time, we own it when we do that. It's more powerful if we take the time, instead of moving to the next slide, have them really discuss with someone, giving them a thinking partner. We want the students to really have an opportunity to pause. That's bringing in some of that wait time. We always hear about wait time, but allowing them first to take the information and then discuss the information. And it doesn't have to be long. It could take 30 seconds. All right. And sometimes I would almost want the discussion to happen prior to really the note taking, like given the slide, and as you give the information, say, okay, let's go ahead and discuss with someone next to you what this slide is saying. Why is this important? And then based on that discussion, make that your notes instead of saying, copy this, because if they copy this, they take pictures of something, it goes back to what you're saying, like who owns it? I don't want to be the owner of the information when I'm teaching. I want the students to take ownership of the information.
Yes, I really like that concept, making them the owners. So thank you for saying that.
So when we're looking at note taking, I really encourage with the teachers that I'm working with is that it becomes a true learning experience instead of a transfer of information experience, so that students not only are able to really comprehend the vital information we're trying to give them as instructors, but we're also facilitating conversations to allow them to process the information. Once they process the information, the note take is always a part of a scaffold, right? So we got to give them this background information, this vital information for them to be successful in the next step. Hopefully the next step is not a test, but it moves into some type of project where they're going to have to tap into that information and actually apply that information. And sometimes what we really lack doing with students is being very transparent, letting them know exactly why you're taking these notes and how these notes are going to help you on the next assignment. Now, of course, they're also going to help you on the test that's eventually coming. But most of the time, like if we're taking notes, I'm always looking for, teachers to give students the opportunity to go from the reading to the writing and to be able to become the ownership of that information. What are your thoughts? How would that work within your classes that you're teaching right now?
I think that that'd be really useful. I mean, anything that I can get them doing, obviously it's for me specifically teaching composition. They're going to be writing an essay, and their whole goal is to be able to express their own thoughts and their own ideas in their own words and still be able to make a strong argument. So I feel like what you're saying would be very useful because it's literally practice for their essays that they're going to be writing, is being able to take this maybe complex information I'm giving them and rephrase it in their own words, but get what they need out of it and not just rephrasing, not just summarizing. Summarizing plus a little bit more, maybe is a good way to say that. So yes. But I can also see outside of my ELA class, any class, I mean, I could see that have been helpful to me in a math class if it's not just knowing the steps, but understanding how the steps work so that when I get a higher level math problem later on, I can understand, oh, this goes back to that thing I learned last semester. So I can see this being very helpful in every class, not just mine, which is always exciting for our listeners who might not be teaching English classes like me. So that seems great. Let's go back to specific things that we can do to create that note-taking strategy.
One thing I would keep in mind is that, like the notes, is that we want to prepare students for their conversations. So the best way to prepare students for a good conversation is taking good notes. But at the same time, we want the students to be able to share different perspectives. My goal is never to have all my students to have the exact same notes. If I'm doing a great job as a facilitator in a classroom, then every student's notes would be different. So that way they're able to bring their own perspective into the conversation and their ideas about what they are learning. So that's one thing that I would say is a tip, is that a lot of times make your note taking open-ended and make it around the discussion of these big ideas. Of course, it allows us as teachers to interject some key ideas within those conversations, but at the same time, students to interject their ideas. I've always suggested that really having the 3 columns, sometimes 2 columns. 2 columns is very simple input output. We're going to have to engage the students in a lot of different information. So we're always inputting information, but at the same time, their output should go back to how do we prove this theory is true? So tying your notes to an essential question or a critical focus question is essential. Sometimes coming back to that question about how can you use your notes to answer this question keeps us really focused on the whole purpose of taking notes.
Can I ask a question really quickly? You're suggesting that I, as the teachers, say this is the essential question, and then that's what they're focusing the notes on. They're not supposed to come up with it. I give them the essential question. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The essential question should be tied directly to the standards, right? So when we
Right.
look at that standard, and sometimes that standard is very broad, but when we unpack that standard into concepts and skills, those concepts then become those questions that we could ask our students that are very broad and open. The easiest ones is like, how might we prevent a pandemic from occurring, right? There are so many different ways. We could look at healthcare, we could look at vaccines, but at the same time, we could look at how we could prevent travel, like no get on airplanes and social distancing. We could look at it as, just isolating the outbreak, like maintaining it. So when you have a very open question, then we're going to be giving the student a lot of information, but they're constantly looking for ideas of how they would explain how we might prevent a pandemic from occurring within the United States or within the world. So the more open that question is to that standard or that concept, let that really drive the note taking, because ultimately we want the student to be able to show mastery of that standard. So if that student could answer that question with evidence of what they have learned or what they have really taken as notes within that class, then we actually see the evidence of that student progression towards mastery.
I think that that's really interesting because I noticed, I wouldn't have thought of it till you just said it. But like at the beginning of each episode, I asked Dan a question. For this episode, I said, hey, do you have anybody that can help me figure out tips on how to make my students better note takers? And of course, he sent me you. And I do that for every episode. So as I'm sitting here taking notes without realizing it, I am filtering it through that question. I'm trying to get the tips. I'm trying to pull out the tips that you're saying. So even though I'm obviously listening to everything you say, I'm pulling out as I'm taking my notes questions that answered that my essential question that I didn't even realize I had, which is, what could I do to get students to be better note takers? So that's my essential question for the day. So all my notes focus around that. And it does help me make me a better note taker because I know what I'm looking for. So even though I didn't know that's what I was doing, I feel like I'm taking your tip here in my own note taking, and I can definitely see how it'd be helpful to students then.
One thing that you just remind me is that sometimes we think that note taking is only between the teacher and the student. But what I've really encouraged and what has been powerful is note taking between student and student. So a lot of times if I have them read an article, I want them, maybe underline the critical information, the key ideas. And then I have them take that, they put it into their notes, they elaborate on it. And then I'll do like an inner outer circle, or my favorite is speed dating. I just like saying speed dating because everyone looks at me crazy. But, I even did it like a couple of days ago with CTE teachers. I just had one line, and then I had like 13 teachers, and then I had 13 teachers face those 13 teachers. But I had them take their notes and share their notes with the person across from them. And then that person across from them was taking notes on the notes that they were sharing with them. And the goal is just to go deeper into that content that we're presenting them. And then after a minute, I have one of the lines rotate one down, and then they share again, and then rotate one. So like 5 minutes, not only are they building confidence in the notes that they took, but they're also validating and getting the feedback and really I would say refining those ideas, that output, when I was talking about the input output, and even in the strategy that I shared with you, that it really starts with those key ideas, those key quotes, that important information. And a lot of times, whatever goes into that column is then how do we make those connections? How do we, really relate it? But then helping the student realize, how do we apply it? Like, how am I going to take these notes and why are these notes going to help me be successful in what I'm doing tomorrow or the following days? So giving the students the opportunity to really refine those ideas through that speed dating activity, or sometimes I'll call it the gauntlet, or you could do as an inner outer circle, depending on the room you have in the class. Usually I only have room for like 2 lines, but if we go outside, I'm definitely doing 2 circles and just having fun with it. But it really allows the students to take ownership.
I really like that. I tried something probably my first semester ever teaching that's another teacher had suggested to me on note taking. And I feel like yours is a better version of what I tried to do, which is that they had me do, they suggested I do something called class note taker. And each class, one student was assigned and they all got assigned at least once over the semester to be the note taker for the day. And they had to take notebook notes for our joint notebook. And then they started the next class. They did a 5-minute summary to remind everybody what we talked about the last class. And there were some things that worked really well with that I really liked. But there were a couple of things that didn't, which is that people ended up relying on the note taker's notes instead of their own. And I wanted them taking their own and putting it in their own words. And I think yours is a updated version of that, in that they're still taking their own notes, but they're still hearing from the other students and getting their perspective, which was the purpose of the class note taker, was to hear not just my words, but another student that thought like them, or closer to them at least, hear it in their words. And so I think that your idea here is really, really helpful for that, because it does have kind of the best of both worlds. So I really like that idea.
Well, if we think of the brain research, right, and the repetition. So if a student says it 7 to 9 times, it starts moving towards that long-term memory. Like, they're going to be able to remember a conversation. Like, I'll always remember this conversation with you. To be able to have those experiences where they're sharing with someone else, it's easy for them to remember the conversation they had, like in a inner outer circle or a speed dating, than remembering what they wrote on a piece of paper. So when it comes time for the test, it's like we're able to recall something we could see, experience. Whereas just recalling words from a page in a book that we read, it's a lot more difficult. So it actually helps the retainability by being able to share their notes with multiple people, because then they have multiple experiences.
Yes, I really like that. I think that's a great idea. All right. Can we go back to, you said one thing that you like is the 3-column format, or 2
Yes.
column. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is and how teachers can use that in their class?
Well, being an advocate of active reading at all times. So anytime a student is engaging in learning, there should be some type of note taking going on. If they're watching a video, if they're pulling information from a PowerPoint, if they're reading a chapter in the book, if they're reading an infographic, if they're looking at a piece of artwork, if they're looking at a math problem, we want it to make it active. So the 3 columns strategy allows any type of, I would say, active reading to occur. So it's just pretty simple. Whatever you're analyzing, you're looking at, whatever you're reading, wherever you're pulling information, that first column in that graphic organizer would be really your key ideas and your keynotes, your summary of what you're learning. Sometimes teachers want to kind of give the students all that information and maybe leave some blanks. We want students to be able to take ownership of it. So they're allowed to pick what they feel is important, but at the same time, they're working that summarizing skill, which is essential. And then from there, in that next column is really like the processing. How do you process that information? What is your reflection? So if you're using it with, like, let's say inner outer circle or speed dating, that second column is where, as they are sharing their ideas and talking, they're writing more reflection into that column. But at the same time, kind of a closing ticket, out the door ticket is, now I want the students to prepare themselves for how they might use this in the bigger assignments. So using that last column to really think about, what is the real world application of this information? Does this information apply to what I have on my agenda for tomorrow, or what the assignment that we're going to finish on Friday is going to be? So it becomes almost like a journal. So next day you would flip it, they would have the same three columns. They could be watching a video, taking notes, conversation, and then reflection at the end of the class. So it's a way to ensure that the students are really comprehending, processing, and seeing the application of the notes that they're taking for that day.
All right. Okay. Well, that sounds great. So I'm going to show, since it's a note taking, I'll show. I don't
You
know.
got three columns?
No, I don't have three columns. I can't because of the background. I'll put it in front of my face. There we go. See, I took no three columns. I need to be better about that. But I took note, and I will share my notes on social media since this is about note taking. I normally don't do that. But I do want to kind of make sure that I used some of your note taking tips to actually take some good notes here and figure out exactly what it is you wanted us to get out of this. So let's
Well,
see.
can you read something from your notes? Just give me something that you have in your notes.
That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sum up what we just talked about and remind everybody what we just said. And I'm going to rely on my great note taking skills here in order to do that. So we first talked about the need to create a strategy. Don't just say, take notes, give them a strategy and a way to take those notes. We talked about chunking and breaking a lesson down into little sections because their attention span is not going to be longer than like 9 to 12 minutes. Then focus on an essential question and make sure your note taking is open-ended. So essential question that can guide their notes as they're taking it. Try things like the 3-column format, which is to have the key concepts. That's what they need to find first. But then a reflection that lets them add their own ideas and show why it matters. And then putting in that real world application. And then try activities that make the note taking more active, like speed dating, speed note taking in class, where they can share their notes with each other and get new notes from what other students said, and they can go and get it from a bunch of people. And they're also at that point repeating what they've heard, and it's lodging in their brains. So how was my summary of what you talked about?
It's a really good summary, but let's go a little bit farther. Can you take one of those key points that you just shared and give me a reflection or a connection? Why is that important?
Okay. So I guess I'll pick make note taking open-ended is something I wrote in my notes. So just like anything, open-ended questions in class, open-ended notes in class, you have more time for reflection if it's open-ended and it's not just a yes or no. If you ask a yes or no question, they're going to write yes on their paper, and that's going to be their notes for the day, and they're not going to get anything of it. But if I can have them focused on an open-ended question that they're going to be answering throughout class, then they will actually not only do better at looking for key concepts around that topic, but they'll also have more room for that reflection piece in the real world application because they're actually able to think about it instead of just writing the fact down.
Excellent reflection. Now let's go into that third column. I really would like to see, what's the real world application. Let's say that you just got a job with NASA and you got brand new astronauts. They're coming to you. How would that benefit them in learning how to prepare to go to outer space?
Okay. I feel like if astronauts, this is tough. Anything science related. I feel like if an astronaut was taking notes about what was happening in outer space, they're going to need to know more. Is that what you mean? Or you mean like how are my notes going to help them?
Okay.
Okay.
You're the trainer. You're training the astronauts to get ready.
I'm training them and they're taking notes. How would me getting them to focus on open-ended questions help them? I have no interest in going to outer space. It sounds very scary. But I feel like if for some reason I had to, if they're forcing me to go to live on Mars or something, I would want to focus on open-ended questions because I don't want to just know, what helmet do I need and what's the oxygen level that I need or whatever. I want to know, what's it like to be on Mars? Like, what do I need to know? What do I need to do? What am I going to feel? What am I going to be thinking? What's going to be the anxieties that I have as somebody who's scared of space and heights, flying up into outer space? I want to know those things for myself. So I don't want just fact-based information. I mean, I do want some fact-based information in that situation, obviously, but I don't want just fact-based. I want to know what the real experience is like.
And I think our students feel the same way when they come to our classroom. Like everything you just said, doesn't matter the content. We want to know more about it. I think sometimes we limit by just giving them the facts. By opening it up, we're allowing curiosity. We're allowing critical thinking. We're allowing problem solving. And so I think your reflection and your applications were spot on. Excellent job.
You could have said smart. Is that what you're going to say? I would have accepted it.
Brilliant. Magnificent.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, you heard that bell. That means we are almost out of time. Do you have some homework for us to do?
Well, definitely my homework is with your next class. Why not try out the 3 columns and really focus more on the processing and the application than the note taking? But the note taking is going to get them to process the information and apply the information. But don't just make it just all about note taking. Make it more about the processing and the application.
All right. I really like that. And I know that you sent me a copy of the 3-column format, a handout that they can use. So I will put that in the show notes so that you can see what the 3-column note-taking format looks like. And you can practice it in your next classes by doing today's homework and then tell us how it goes on social media. So thank you for being here today, Donn. I think this has been great. I hope you enjoyed it too.
I definitely did.
All right. Well, good. We hope to have you back one day and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
All right, Ashley, what did you hear there that really stood out to you?
I really like the games that he suggested, that like the speed dating. I think of note taking as something you sit there and do at your desk. And I like the idea of making it an activity, just like any other activity where they practice the note taking and they report it to other people in a fun way. So that to me was a really good tip that I'd like to try.
Mm-hmm. The idea of using your notes. How are you going to use your notes? Taking them off the paper and giving them practice with that is so important.
Yeah.
And that's something that he was talking about. So I'm thinking about what Donn did from the view of an instructional coach. If I'm an instructional coach and I want to help teachers with taking notes, what are some things that I heard him do? And the first thing he asked was, he tried to zero in on your purpose. He said, why are you having them take notes? And I thought that was a great question because it made you reflect on something that maybe you hadn't even thought about deeply, right? Sometimes we just have kids take notes because it's time to take notes. But what is the
you're
goal?
supposed to take notes, so take notes. That's the purpose. It's one of those things like when you ask your parent, why is that the rule? Because I said so.
Why is this important? What does this have to do with our goal for this class? And so that other thing that I heard him do was talk about transference. So as an instructional coach, you often work not just with one department. You often have to work with English teachers, math teachers. And one of the keys of education, I think, is teaching kids skills that they can transfer from class to class. And he was probing you and asking you about how this skill could be used in different classes and how it could be applied across the curriculum. And that's just a probing question and a focus that I think as a coach, it's important to keep in our minds. What skills are we teaching kids that can be applied in multiple classes that are learning skills?
Yeah, well, that's a really good point, and it is something that I'm always interested in, this transference, not just from class to class, but from grade to grade, from the
Yeah.
class to work, anything like that. So any skill that you can use across everything you do is really great.
Another coaching step he took that I think is important is helping you to think about how the notes connect to your critical focus question, because he was trying to keep you focused on the purpose of taking notes, right? So that's the
Right.
whole thing about what I said. Why are you taking notes? Keeping it focused, keeping our conversations focused on the purpose of what it is you're trying to accomplish. And, he was talking to you about essential questions and having a big essential question and then taking notes to answer those questions. And I thought that was important coaching move because it connected the strategy to the content you're trying to help students learn.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah. And then the one last thing I wanted to mention, which is, if you notice, he kept referring to some brain research. At one point, he talked about repetition and how repetition helps you learn. And at another point, he talks about chunking and how, you can only pay attention to something for so long. The brain can only do that. I believe, and Donn does too, that as coaches, we need to really study how the brain learns, how the brain processes information and stores information for a long time so that you can retrieve it. And what I hear in that conversation is that Donn has studied not just literacy or note taking, but how the brain processes information. And my recommendation for any instructional coach is to find literature and make yourself a learning expert, not just a teaching expert. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I do think that matters. Knowing the way people think and the way they learn helps you as a teacher, no matter what your subject is. And it also, I can see, helping any instructional coach help a teacher. So I
Yep.
think that's a really great point.
Sometimes we're content experts. Like, I'm an expert in history or in literature, but I need to be an expert in how the brain learns to read
Right.
and how the brain learns math best. That's what I need to truly master as a instructional coach and be able to share that with others. So those are my coaching points from Donn's conversation.
All right. Well, I think those are really great points. I think they'll be very useful. So thank you for joining me again today to help us find the coaching tips from our lesson, and have a great rest of your day. I'm looking forward to talking to you next week.
Absolutely. See you then.
All right. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Class Act Coaching, brought to you by the Southern Regional Education Board. SREB is a nonprofit dedicated to improving education from pre-K all the way to PhD and into the workforce. Visit sreb.org for resources on instructional practices, teacher data, career pathways, and more. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook at SREB-School Improvement and on Twitter/X and Instagram, both at SREB Education. See you next week.